Welcome to biztech's APAC Ambassador Conversation series. Today, the focus is on South Africa. South Africa is one of the leading economies on the African continent and is influential in geopolitics. Yet, its importance and influence is not well understood in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, today we have His Excellency David Malcomson, High Commissioner of South Africa to Malaysia, to help us understand South Africa better and shed light on its relationship with Malaysia. Now, Your Excellency, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to you and BizTech Asia for giving us the opportunity to have this engagement.
Now, to start off with, Ambassador, could you give us an overview of the South African economy today?
Thank you. Yes, I think it's in many ways pretty similar to Malaysia. We are also an upper middle income country. We're a mixed economy. We have a GDP that's currently valued at about $418 billion and is projected in 2022 to be $435 billion. In terms of foreign reserves, we currently have 58.1 billion in March 2022 that went up to 60.2 billion in April 2022. On purchasing power parity, we're currently rated at 19th in the world, which puts us in the G20. We've been in the G20 for quite some time now as the only African member. And I think the important part of being part of the African continent is, as much as we always drive our bilateral relations, we see ourselves very much as part and parcel of the African continent. And in that regard, whatever we bring bilaterally, we also have behind us the newly formed and operational African Continental Free Trade Area of approximately 1.1 billion people. In Africa itself, we are the most industrialized, diversified, and technologically advanced of the African countries. And it is the country that has produced things like the first heart transplant, the first technology converting coal to oil, coal to fuel, that we invented the CAT scan. We've produced people like Elon Musk, Trevor Noah. So across the board, whatever sector you look at, South Africans have been involved in technological development, in industrial development, manufacturing, and so on. At the moment, as I said, we are a mixed economy. We're a diversified economy. So the bulk of our economy is based on the services sector, the manufacturing and industrial sector, and on agriculture and agro-processing. We've done particularly well in the agricultural and agro-processing sectors in the last couple of years, and we're currently the second biggest citrus exporter in the world. And I think it's in this sector particularly that we have a convergence between the needs of Malaysia and what South Africa can provide. In this age of increased need for food security, inflation, rising food prices, and so on, I think that's a very good meeting ground where Malaysia's interests coincide with our interests.
Now, Your Excellency, I'm going to come back to you on that a little later up in the show, but just to give some context in terms of South Africa's economy, 25% is basically finance and services, 20% is mining, and about 13% is manufacturing. So that alone is more than 50%. It's not quite what people think in terms of South Africa and diamond mining and so forth. But one of the things that people don't also are not very aware of is the fact that the Johannesburg Stock Exchange is the 18th largest in the world and the 8th largest telecommunication network operator in the world is actually a South African company called MTN Group Limited. So you have some really large champions within South Africa itself.
Correct, and thank you for noting those two excellent examples of how South African companies have succeeded globally. There are many other examples. For example, there's a company that owns a significant portion of Tencent in China. And there's companies, you mentioned mining, of course, we are well known for the gold and diamonds, but I think less well known is how strategic our position is in the world of natural resources. We have something like 88% of the world reserves of the platinum group metals, 80% of the manganese, 72% of chrome, 27% of vanadium, and the list of the natural resources goes on and on. I think as a country, though, we've been stuck for far too long in just being an exporter of these raw materials. And I think one area where we can partner with Malaysia and other countries in ASEAN is in the whole field of beneficiation, of getting greater value from the natural resources that we have.
Okay, let's start by giving us a perspective of the bilateral trade picture with Malaysia and South Africa. What does that look like now?
Well, at the moment, it's quite heavily skewed in favor of Malaysia, but that's based basically on two products, on the petroleum oils and on the palm oils. Whereas on our side, 20% or so of our exports to Malaysia are in the manganese concentrates. There is a South African company that's involved in a manganese smelter in Sarawak. So consistently over the years in the export basket from South Africa to Malaysia, it's 20% manganese, and more now the fruit side of things is emerging. So the other top four exports are all in the various fruit groups, be it citrus or grapes or so on. And then lower down, we get into the rolled and milled steel product. But again, as I say, I think in terms of Malaysia's net import status of food, we can certainly provide a very viable option for Malaysia in terms of quality and price when it comes to fruit, vegetables, and particularly now in the halal sector.
And also, and I want to zoom in on that because halal, obviously, South Africa could play a role in terms of partnering with Malaysia in terms of being a gateway to Africa, which has a very large Muslim population. Also, I believe that South Africa has a lot of large retail companies that actually have distribution across the African continent.
I think you've been reading my strategic objective documents.
Yes, actually, it's part of my research.
Because this is exactly right. What we've been saying to our Malaysian partners is that much as we have a small Muslim population, we are in the top 5 to 7 global producers of halal products. And 60% of all the products you find in our retail stores are halal certified. 3 of our halal certification authorities are recognized by JAKIM. So we meet the highest standards when it comes to halal certification. And as you've said, I think the one project that has immense potential where we can both benefit is for Malaysia to invest in halal parks in South Africa, to treat South Africa as a halal hub into the rest of Africa, where you have between 500 and 600 million Muslims in the African continent. As you've said, we have the banking infrastructure in Africa, we have the retail infrastructure in Africa, the telecoms. South African companies operate throughout the African continent, and we also are heavily involved in the infrastructure links. The exciting part of that is, as I've said, both at the Southern African level, but continent-wide, we now have a free trade area that brings the whole continent together. So I think that, as you've said, Malaysian and South African companies working together, where we can leverage the gold standard certification of the Malaysian halal authorities, and Malaysia can leverage our linkages, both infrastructural and otherwise, into Africa, we can both then benefit from the halal products of both South Africa and Malaysia going into Africa. But equally in the reverse, we see Malaysia as a gateway to ASEAN. And we believe that working with Malaysia, we can service both your own markets, but also through Malaysia, reach into other markets in ASEAN and even wider afield, leveraging on the Belt and Road Initiative of China, where now there are these linkages from Kunming down, reaching into Perlis and so on, where we can use Perlis as one example, as a transshipment hub then for products into Malaysia and also wider afield in ASEAN and into China.
That's an interesting proposition, and I'm going to keep my eye on that in terms of Perlis being identified as a transshipment point. But Ambassador, then currently, who are the significant South African investors in Malaysia, and which are significant Malaysian businesses that have invested substantially in South Africa?
If you don't mind, I'd like to answer that question by going back a little bit in history. There was the time between 1994 and 2005 which one could characterize as the golden era of the bilateral relationship between Malaysia and South Africa. And at that point, Malaysia was the 7th biggest investor in South Africa. That relationship operated very effectively across the economic sphere, in the political sphere, in the South-South cooperation. But somehow from 2005 onwards, and particularly after the financial crisis in 2008, there was a period where we lost strategic focus on each other. There was disinvestment from South Africa. Malaysia and South Africa turned more and more inwards in terms of domestic politics. We turned more and more regional, where Malaysia concentrated far more on ASEAN and the OIC than on their previous relations with Africa, for example. And South Africa equally was very engaged in the project of building the African Union, the new Partnership for Africa's Agenda Development, Agenda 2063, and so on. So in all of that, we lost that strategic focus. And I believe it's now time that we regain that strategic focus. So the long-winded way of answering your question is to say that the investors that we have in each other's countries now are not a good reflection of the potential for investment between ourselves. So in the case of Malaysia and South Africa, Petronas is a majority shareholder in our fuel company, Engen. There's also a couple of other companies, Sime Darby Plantation, UEM Sunrise, involved in a port development project. And conversely, South Africa in Malaysia, we have, as I've said, the manganese smelter in Sarawak. We have a life insurance company, Sanlam, that has partnered with MCIS Life. And of course, the famous Nando's that everybody knows about is South African. And that's a sector we are also targeting, is working with Petronas and others in Malaysia to increase quite rapidly the number of South African franchises in the Malaysian market.
Now, Your Excellency, I'm going to ask you about diplomatic relations between both our countries. But before that, we actually have historical ties that go back to the Dutch colonial times and the Cape Malays. Could you kind of walk us through some of our historical, these long historical ties, and how we are engaged on a cultural, educational, and arts basis today?
I'm glad you raised that, because I think that's this kind of knowledge and understanding of each other that's been lost over the last decade or so. We have a very rich cultural heritage together. The fact that there is Islam in South Africa is on the back of the fact that the Dutch brought what they call troublesome imams from the Malay archipelago to South Africa. So in the time where we were both colonized by the Dutch, or this region of the world was colonized by the Dutch, people were brought from the Malay archipelago to South Africa. The modern day result of that is we have a community in the Cape called the Cape Malay community that have very strong cultural cuisine and other traditions linked back to the Malay archipelago. And you see that reflected in the cuisine, in the religion, even in the language. We have words like pisang, blatjan, aspak, which directly come from this part of the world. So there is that very rich cultural heritage that I think we need to leverage far more into the future as we go forward, as you say, in the people-to-people cooperation, in helping to spread knowledge and understanding of each other more widely, and in terms of what we can help each other with in education and in training. Currently, there are quite a few Malaysian students who do go and study in South African madrasas. And equally, they traditionally, up until COVID, there were Malaysian universities that helped to train South African kids. But I think that's something we've lost over the COVID period, and we can go back to that. But even looking at how Malaysian universities can start putting up satellite campuses, doing more virtual learning in this modern era, and looking at how we can ensure that we assist each other in training the youngsters of today for the world of tomorrow. Again, because of the hiatus in the bilateral relationship and the need to revive the bilateral relationship, the whole area of arts, culture, education are underserved at the moment. So we are working on a draft memorandum of understanding on culture, on agreements for mutual recognition of each other's academic qualifications and so on and so forth. But again, as with other aspects of the bilateral relationship, I think there's far more that we can still do.
So again, I think the relationships, as you mentioned, was really at the peak during the Tun Mahathir era, where we had the Langkawi International Dialogue, which I had a privilege to attend, I think in 2002 or 2003, and really relationships with not just South Africa, but with Africa were very, very close. Now, it is very important also for Malaysia today to engage with Africa. Africa is the fastest growing region in the world moving forward today and moving forward. What does Malaysia really need to re-engage with South Africa? What do we need to do?
I think on both sides, because we've lost that strategic focus, it's about making a conscious effort to look at each other again, to recognize the capabilities that we have and what it can mean in terms of mutual benefit. So in the engagement that I've been having and that other African ambassadors have been having with the Malaysian authorities, particularly the foreign ministry, is to say, you need to be looking at what's happening in Africa. You need to be looking at why are so many countries pouring billions of dollars into Africa, be it China, Turkey, UAE, Brazil. There's huge amounts of money going into Africa for very good reason. Africa is on the move. There's that tagline, Africa Rising. And that's a very real phenomenon. And I think Malaysia may be missing its cue at the moment and would need to focus on why is the world engaging Africa so heavily in terms of economic opportunities. More than that, as I've said earlier, I think one of the key challenges facing Malaysia as a net food importer is the whole question of food security.
Absolutely.
We believe that Africa is the future of food security. 60% of the arable land that will be available in the future is in Africa. So we believe that on quality, on price, and on the diversification of supply chains, Malaysia would need to look at Africa. I think COVID has taught all of us that with the disrupted supply chains, you need to have a diversified basket of supply chain. And equally, you can't be linked just to a few food importers. So I think in Malaysia's case, it's basically Brazil, Australia, China, and a couple of others, India, that provide the bulk of the food imports. And we think that Africa and South Africa in particular offer very viable alternatives in terms of quality food at a price that the people, particularly in the B40, can afford in Malaysia.
Your Excellency, it's been a fascinating conversation. But before we end this interview, any final words you'd like to leave the audience with?
Well, I think just to say that certainly on our side, and the feeling I'm getting from the Malaysian interlocutors, is we have reached a key moment now where we realize that we dropped the ball in essence for the last 10 or so years. And there's a commitment on both sides to revive the strategic relationship. To that end, my Minister of International Relations and Cooperation will be visiting Malaysia in July. And we're hoping for reciprocal visits to South Africa next year. So to use the high-level meetings to send a political message that we are doing a reset. And there are aspects of what South Africa can provide that Malaysia needs that are of mutual benefit to both of us. But equally, there's things that Malaysia can provide that we need. And even at a higher level, there's issues like the issue of Palestine, where Malaysia and South Africa are very strong on the issue of Palestine. Few countries speak about Palestine anymore, but South Africa and Malaysia do speak about Palestine. There's issues like that. There's issues like being members of the Indian Ocean Rim Association, members of the non-aligned movement. We're very like-minded on many issues globally and how to benefit from things like the blue economy, the green economy, where there's a lot we can do going forward. And I think there is this recognition that we need to get back to that position where we are favored strategic partners of each other.
Now, Your Excellency, thank you very much for taking your time to be on this show.
Thank you very much, Brian. I've really enjoyed meeting you, and I hope we can continue in the future having a relationship like this.
Thank you. I'm Brian Fernandez, and I've been speaking to His Excellency David Malcomson, High Commissioner of South Africa to Malaysia, on biztech's APAC Ambassador Conversation series. This video and podcast will be on our social media platforms as well as our website, www.biztech.asia. Please like and subscribe to our various platforms. Thanks again for tuning in.